Welcome everyone to another session that Hanover's graciously is presenting to on behalf of for Radford, I should say. This session is on academic writing versus grant writing. So today we have with us Sarah Otto. She'll be going over the material. But beforehand, I'll introduce myself. I'm Tom Cruz, the Director of Sponsored Programs, and I would like to get a little quick description of our relationship with Hanover and how they can best support you. So we are under a contract with Hanover. There are consultants for several different related grant activities. We work with them on grant revisions or grant reviews. So if you're working on a proposal, you can certainly reach out to myself or Pam Frazier, and we can put you in the queue, in their workload queue, so that they can offer assistance for reviewing proposals or reviewing revisions. And also, they are very supportive to us in terms of providing outreach and training. If you're familiar with that, you would recognize Hanover being on campus. They usually come out to campus once a year to give workshops on various topics. So stay on the lookout for that as we continue to announce these opportunities. And lastly, what we use them for too is prospecting. So for those faculty members who have ideas but aren't really sure where direction they want to go or what all's out there in terms of funding possibilities, you can get in the queue and work with Hanover on prospecting for sponsors. Well, they will provide you with a very comprehensive report of several different funding agencies, federal nonprofit agencies that could be of interest to you. So again, these are wonderful services that I hope each of you take advantage of. We've had a great relationship with Hanover, and we look forward to the continued relationship. So, with that said, I will gladly turn it over to Sarah for her presentation today.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Everyone, let me know if you have any issues seeing the slides or need them to be magnified, just let me know and I can do that. So today's webinar, From Publications to Proposals, essentially academic writing versus grant writing, like Tom said. I'm Sarah Ott. I'm a senior grants consultant here at Hanover Research. So whether you're a seasoned researcher or just getting started, today's session is going to help you rethink how to translate your academic expertise into compelling and fundable grant proposals. So I have been writing grants since graduate school. I have supported faculty across disciplines in securing over $100 million. I'm not sure where I'm at right now, but I work most with Hanover's NIH team, and I'm excited to share some practical insights today that you can apply to your next grant proposal. So this is going to be a 45-minute presentation, followed by about 15 minutes for Q&A. You're welcome to type questions into the chat at any time or wait until the end. We are providing a recording of this session along with the slides, and that will be sent out to all registrants. So our roadmap for today, we're going to look at how grant writing differs from academic publishing, the common moves of successful grant proposals, how to structure and frame your narrative, and then I'm going to close with some practical tools that you can use. So in academic publishing, which most of you are familiar with, success often comes from your theoretical contribution. In grant writing, success comes from strategic communication. So we need to be able to demonstrate value, feasibility, and alignment with funder goals. Funders aren't journal editors, they are investors. And they want to see past performance, your potential for scalability, and sustainability. So here's a side by side. We're looking at the emphasis of academic writing versus grant writing. Academic writing emphasizes novelty and argument, and grant writing is going to emphasize feasibility, clarity, and impact. And you often have to do that within a tight page limit and within strict formatting guidance. So with academic writing, we are trying to show that we know what we are talking about, that we know a lot about our field, that we are knowledgeable of the terminology, of the common terminology of our peers, and that we are unbiased. Grant writing is really persuasive writing, so very different. We are, instead of trying to communicate how knowledgeable we are, we're trying to communicate what a gap in evidence or a problem is that we are trying to solve, and then to persuade the reviewers and the funding agency that we are the best person to lead an effort to do that. So the structure of grant writing is typically more formulaic. It's going to be the writing needs to be clearer. There needs to be less jargon, less terminology that you might use in a publication, and we need to focus on feasibility, the feasibility of the work, the return on investment, and the outcomes. So a quick poll, if you're able to contribute here, which part of grant writing feels most unfamiliar or challenging to you? So would that be the structure, the style and tone, framing the so what? So why is it important, or the budget and logistics? So just take a moment to respond, and I can use your input to guide the discussion if anyone has particular areas that they feel like they are most unfamiliar with or struggle with while they are writing grant proposals. When we're writing grants, when you're writing a publication, you're thinking about the editors and what they want to see. And when we are writing grants, we should be thinking about what the funders want to see. So whatever reviewer is asking is this a good fit? Can they pull it off? Will this work have an impact? And your job is to make it easy for the reviewers to say yes. So funders want 4 things the most, and that is alignment with their mission, the clear problem and solution, a credible team and plan, and good value for the investment. So that means evidence of your capacity to deliver similar results, and the return on investment, how broad your reach is going to be. So alignment with the vision in the mission is simple to communicate. In our proposals, we tell the reviewers and the funders that our work is in alignment with their mission and vision, and how that is so. With the clear problem and viable solution, this is going to be the most difficult part. This is your proposal narrative, your research strategy, and describing what that gap in evidence or that problem is you're going to solve, and your proposed solution and why it will work. A credible team and plan. When you're writing your proposal, we need to talk about the team, whether that's in attachments or in the proposal narrative, and I'll talk more about that later. And then the evidence of capacity, having past work or past successful grant experiences you can point to, and then showing how you're going to sustain that. So showing that with this proposal, you're going to be able to have an impact, a broader impact, and that your reach is going to go beyond just, let's say, your research, your lab, or your team. So I know many of you have recently published, and that's great, and that momentum is valuable. But funders aren't looking for the same thing as journal editors or peer reviewers in that respect, as far as journals go. So there are moves, what I'm referring to here, that reviewers expect to see. You want to lead with the need. This is just a common expectation across most grant funders and typically within their parameters of how they want you, their guidance on how they want you to outline your proposal narrative. You want to begin with the problem, the need that you are going to address. It can be very difficult, but it is recommended that you focus on one need, one gap that your project is addressing. If your project is multifactorial, if you're addressing a number of problems directly within the specific aims or the objectives of your project, it's going to be important to keep those avenues as clear as possible and to clearly communicate each gap and how your project addresses it. But one is usually the best. So most projects, if you're writing a typical project, you're typically going to be directly addressing one gap or one need. Signal that alignment in your proposal. So let the reviewers and the funder know that you're aligned and how, and explicitly state that. Pre-sell your credibility. So in your research strategy, your proposal narrative, in addition to your bio sketches and your attachments, you want to show that you're the right person, the right team to conduct the work that you're proposing. Quantify your outcomes or clearly show your expected outcomes, your hypotheses for all of your work, and be repetitive. So unlike journal writing, you really want to repeat those key messages, and your job is to remove friction. So we, instead of communicating that we are knowledgeable and the work we have done, we are removing friction and making our narrative as easy for reviewers to understand and easy for them to say, yes, I want to fund this. So here's an example. And on the left, so the journal abstract really leans on theory and scholarly debate. So you can see how this is emphasizing theory, methods, scholarly contributions. This is what we would typically see for an academic journal article. Here below, we have a grant proposal introduction with a funder-focused style, the style I have been talking about so far. And this frames a need. It cites relevant data. So it's leading with the need, cites relevant data, and gives the reader a preview of the proposed solution. So you can see this shift in audience and tone. And the grants version is more sort of shifting from analytical to action oriented and persuasive. And that's really the mindset shift that we're aiming for when you're writing grant proposals. So proposal structure, when you look at a notice of funding opportunity, a funding opportunity announcement, most funding agencies are going to have a recommended structure. Some do not, and you'll have to make those decisions as far as how you will want to organize your thoughts. But for the most part, the proposal structure is strategic, even the recommended structure from the funding agencies. So funders need to know that you can execute and that your project will deliver. So each section is going to answer a specific question in the reviewer's mind. Every section of the grant has a job. So the needs section frames the problem or the gap. The methods section is really to communicate your feasibility when you're writing a grant proposal. The evaluation is going to build on your credibility and the rigorousness of your plan. And the sustainability is going to address this return on investment or impact we've been discussing. So you do want to use funder templates and guidelines to your advantage because they are telling you how to win the grant. They are recommending a structure in a strategic way. It's not just bureaucratic. So we can also use tools. Reviewers are reviewing sometimes 6 to a half a dozen to a dozen grants in one review session, depending on the funding agency and the particular field you're in. So we need to make what they are looking for. This information, we need to make it as easy to find as possible. And there are some ways we can do that with visuals and the way that we write. So there are some tools like logic models, using SMART objectives, writing plain language summaries, and using templates and checklists that can help you translate your dense academic work into funder-friendly narratives. And the templates and checklists also help to ensure you hit all the funders' required elements. So logic models, the main components of a logic model are your inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. So inputs are the resources invested in the project. Resources in a logic model for a grant proposal typically include personnel, partners, collaborators, facilities, students, contractors, if you have an evaluator who is going to evaluate the work, and any funding that you're going to provide, maybe through matching funds or from the grant itself. Activities are the processes or actions that the project will perform. So that could include recruitment, training, marketing, evaluation, dissemination. Whatever you're going to do should be built into the activities. Then you have your outputs, and outputs are really critical. You need to make this distinction between outputs and outcomes. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide or two. But outputs are the expected results from the project, from the implementation of the project, whereas the outcomes are the impact. So outcomes are the program effectiveness. Let's say you are working on something like a STEM project. You might have inputs like the $100,000 grant from the funder, personnel, your project coordinators, for instance, resources like curriculum materials, partnerships with community organizations, teacher training workshops could be one of the activities. Curriculum development could be an activity, student engagement, for instance. And then outputs might be the number of workshops. So you had 10 professional development workshops, or the training. So maybe you train 50 rural teachers to provide STEM education. So that's outputs are more process oriented. Whereas outcomes are typically changes resulting from the impact of the project. So you're going to have short-term outcomes that take place, let's say, in weeks or months, medium-term or intermediate outcomes that are going to take place during the time period of the grant, months to years, and these long-term outcomes, which could take place beyond the grant period. So the stages of outcomes, these are from University of Wisconsin Extension. So in the short term, what you expect to happen with people as you implement an approach to educate them or raise their awareness is that their awareness, their knowledge, their attitudes, skills, and opinions are going to change. they're learning in the short term. So those would be short-term outcomes. In the medium term, their behavior is going to change. So they take what they've learned, their knowledge, their attitudes, their new skills, and they're putting them into action. So they're now behaving differently. They're making different decisions. So people are now aware of things that they weren't clued into before. And the long-term changes and conditions are occurring. So imagine you're dealing with test grades or student decision making, let's say on going to college. The conditions are changing, and you may also have GPAs going up. And so we can measure that. Maybe students report on their engagement survey that they're more engaged in their courses, or students went on to a graduate school program. So that's what you'll be expecting to see in the long-term outcomes within your logic model. So you can use logic models. Some funding agencies require logic models as a part of the grant proposal, but you can also include one, even if it's not required. You want to see sort of what the acceptability is from the funding agency of including logic models. And you can do that by talking with your peers who have applied before, asking a consultant like us here at Hanover what's typical for what funder. Some funding agencies like to see logic models in proposals. Some it might be more rare to see. And then you can also use logic models as a planning tool. So you can put one of these together before you write your proposal to make sure that your ideas connect, and you'll be better able to communicate that connection in a proposal narrative if you complete a logic model first. You can also use a logic model as an easy visual tool to share with potential partners and collaborators in the early phases of grant proposal development to describe your project. Excuse me. So SMART objectives. When you are working with a funding agency that wants to see project objectives, let's say, versus aims, specific aims, and that's going to depend on the funder and the terminology and the way they like to see your methods. But if you're working with a funding agency that wants to see objectives, the best approach is using SMART objectives. You might also hear from some funders SMART goals. They are the same thing. They just use different terminology. So SMART meaning specific, you're going to clearly define what you are going to do. Measurable, you're going to include some criteria to track progress. Achievable, so it's ambitious but realistic. You're showing the feasibility of it. And relevant, you want to make sure that the objective supports your larger priorities and fits in with the other objectives in the project. Time bound, you want to tie the objective to a clear time frame or deadline. So here we have an example. We're going to train 25 rural high school staff in youth mental health first aid by December 2025 to increase early identification and referral of students experiencing mental health challenges. So we have sort of targeted a specific group here. We're saying rural high school staff. So it's specific. Our activity is specific, training in youth mental health first aid. It's measurable. We're training 25 staff. It's achievable within a sort of a reasonable scope for typical programs. It's relevant because it addresses early identification and support for youth mental health, which our funding agency wants to see. And it's time bound. We've said we're going to do this by December 2025. So use SMART objectives when you're working with a funding agency that wants to see program objectives. Common mistakes in proposal narrative, common pitfalls include leading with the theory instead of the need. So writing more in that, in the publication style where you're talking more about theory in the beginning instead of leading with the gap or the need. Also, assuming the reviewer shares your expertise. So reviewers are typically in our area of research or in the field more broadly, but they may not share your exact expertise or understand your proposal without some context. And also just forgetting that the budget is a part of the story, that your budget needs to align with the proposal narrative and it needs to make sense. You can overload with citations. That is more of the academic writing style. So, for a literature review, for a significance section, for a background section, we really want to limit that to what specifically supports the proposed project objectives or aims. So we don't want this long laundry list of literature without sort of tying in how our proposed work is going to build on those studies or is different from those studies. So think about seminal articles, think about the citing articles by potential reviewers, and the main citations you need to communicate your project for reviewers to be able to assess its feasibility. And then we always want to write from the funder's perspective. So make the case for why your work is worth investing in. I have a reframing exercise here. And I really just want to encourage you to take 3 to 5 minutes to look at this sample excerpt here and practice reframing like we've talked about. So this excerpt is really written in a journal style. And I want to know how you would revise it to lead with the need to use more accessible language and to make a case for action. And if you want to take 3 to 5 minutes to do this and just share your version in the chat, we would like to see what your ideas are as far as how you would rewrite this. If you're watching this as a recording, feel free to do this on your own and try to communicate the grant style with this excerpt. And then I will provide you with a brief example here in a minute. Okay, so if you're still working on that, that is fine. I'm going to show a sample here of a reframed version. And this is just one possible version. Notice how it starts with a gap in services, then proposes a solution. And this style is more aligned with what funders want to see: urgency, clarity, and a call to action. So now I'm going to talk more about the specific sections of the proposal and how you would focus on parts of this as parts of the narrative. So for the introduction, you want to start strong. You want to spark interest and orient reviewers to your project goals. We really want to avoid meandering or overloading with background details. So engaging the reviewer, engaging the reader, and getting them excited about your project to where they want to read more. For this section, so if you have an introduction section in the guidance of the funding agency, a specific introduction section, I have seen PIs, the common issue is writing too much in this section. So oftentimes, if you're working with a funding agency that has this section, you likely have introduction and then you have a need section or a problem statement. So for the introduction, before you work yourself into the needs section, you want to just have a quick synopsis of what is the gap in evidence, what are your activities. So this should be very abbreviated, the type of project you're going to do. It could be the objective of your project. And then the expected outcomes, hypotheses, that sort of thing. And maybe a paragraph to a page, depending on the type of proposal you're writing. But your introduction should not be an entire background section or significant section. That is for the other sections that will follow the introduction. So the statement of the problem, sometimes there is a needs section depending on the funding agency. We're just going to talk a little bit about sort of common thread components here. So for this, we're looking at inspiring the reviewer. Why is this problem worth solving? And so this is the so what that Will mentioned here. We want to not only describe the gap in evidence or the problem, but why the question or the problem is important to solve. Sometimes there are problems or avenues of research that have not been completed, and the reviewers might think that that's because it's not important to do so. So it's not going to matter how much we communicate that there is a gap if they think that it's not important or worth tracking down. So we want to be able to communicate not only the gap and the problem, but its importance. So a literature review, and this can come in many forms. This might be a significance section, a background section, a background and significance section. But what is important here is that we don't have that laundry list that I mentioned of literature, that we are describing, sort of mapping the territory. So you can go from broad to narrow and cover key studies. But as you move through, you want to clearly identify the gaps your project fills in those areas and how your work is building on previous studies, how it's different from previous studies. So you want to give some context of instead of saying so and so found this and so found this, we are saying that that work had certain implications for our proposed study. So this should show that you understand your field, show the gap, cover your bases in terms of those important citations. So you don't want to admit key citations, but you also don't want to have a long list of citations just to do so. And make sure you always address any conflicting work. So if there are studies that show different results and there is conflict, you want to show the studies that have conflict and explain why you think that is and how your work is going to address that conflict. For conceptual framework, so sometimes this is going to be a separate section. Sometimes this will be a part of your approach or methods, or even a part of your background, depending on the funding agency. When you speak to your conceptual framework, You want to discuss what theories or concepts guide your work, but you also want to discuss how they translate into your proposed activities. So we want to be specific about how you're applying the theory or the conceptual framework to your specific project. We don't just want to describe or define the theory separately from our project. So we're bridging that gap between theory and practice. For aims, objectives, research questions, I mentioned this at the beginning of the session, but it's really important to know the terminology that the agency uses most. So if you were looking at an agency like National Science Foundation, you would use objectives and research questions. If you're looking at a funding agency like National Institutes of Health, you would speak to specific aims. So make sure you know what that expectation is for the funding agency you're targeting. These are really the anchors of your proposal. So you want to make sure that your research questions are testable, your objectives are measurable, and everything flows logically from your problem statement. Again, the logic model can help you to do this and to show those relationships. So a research project can fail if the objectives and the hypothesis are poorly focused or underdeveloped. So we want to make sure that you have those nailed down and as strong as possible before you begin writing the full proposal. So if you are developing a logic model, if you're developing a concept paper or a specific aims document to share with a program officer of the funding agency, this is a good time to solidify your specific aims, your objectives, and to have others, peers, program officers look at those before you begin writing the full study. For the methods section or the approach, you want to describe exactly what you plan to do and how you'll do it. So reviewers need to trust that your approach is feasible and appropriate, and clarity is key here. We don't want to assume reviewers will fill in the gaps. So this should really build confidence among your reviewers that your project is worth funding. We want to convince the reviewers and the agency that your design and your analytical strategies are going to address the specific problem or gap that you identified. So show that the selected methods will enable you to interpret the data and outcomes. Be particular about the methodological techniques you're using for data collection, analysis, external validation, and be sure to explain how this is the best approach to examine the issue. Make sure you are always discussing risks and contingency plans, so potential problems and so alternative solutions. And show a clear link between your research objectives, your specific aims, and your methods. You want to introduce the methods proposed, so whether they are quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, provide background information about the methods and the application, usually very brief, but enough to where if the reviewer was not so let's say you have a mixed methods proposal and the reviewer is not typically used to reviewing qualitative methods, you might need to describe qualitative methods a bit more if you think the reviewers might have less expertise in that. So articulate the methodological connection by explaining the relevance of your approach to the overall research design. Make those clear connections and describe the instruments you're going to use, how you're going to analyze the results, the sampling process, so statistics, power analysis, sample size, and any research limitations. Again, it sort of fits into the potential challenges, but any limitations and challenges and how you're going to mitigate that risk. For the evaluation plan, so some funding agencies are going to require an evaluation plan outside of the typical data analysis or analysis that you might complete for your specific aims. So typically, if they are asking for an evaluation plan, it is a programmatic evaluation plan. So you're going to describe how you're going to evaluate your project, not your aims necessarily. So evaluation demonstrates accountability. So you want to include both formative and summative approaches. Explain the tools you'll use to evaluate, whether that's surveys, access to data, the timelines, and link the evaluation back to your objectives and your aims. So if you're partnering with an internal or external evaluator, be sure to describe who that is, what their expertise is, and include their credentials and their bio sketches and attachments for the proposal. One important piece of evaluation is we don't want to provide an evaluation that is out of scale with the funder or the work. So if the funding agency requires an external evaluator, of course, use an external evaluator. However, if there's no requirement for an external evaluator, then we recommend that you use either your own evaluation skills or somebody internal to the institution to evaluate your work. For budgets, budgets should be realistic and aligned with your narrative. So you want to gather your estimates early, show how you'll get the work done that you're proposing, and make sure that it is telling the same story and matches your narrative. So that the titles of the personnel match between the budget and the proposal narrative. If you're making changes to the budget, that you go back to the narrative and make sure that you've made changes there as well, and vice versa. So talk with faculty, talk with your internal folks who help to make sure that you're requesting the right salary, that the level of effort you're requesting is typical for that funding agency, those sorts of things. It can be really helpful to have some sort of internal spreadsheet to work out your budget numbers and then sort of translate that into the funder's required forms at the end. And that typically avoids turning in a budget that is not the final budget as well. For the budget narrative, this is where you're going to explain the why behind the numbers. So you're going to show your calculations, link them back to a project activity or an objective. This is very important because if you're not describing, if you're not discussing the why and showing why it's important, then it can be easier for the funding agency to come back and say, we really want to fund you, but can we cut $5,000 from this particular line? So we want to have a very clear budget narrative and to make sure that you're linking the items back to the activities. So it shows why they are necessary. So here's some great resources to support your grant writing further. We have the National Organization for Research Development Professionals, or NORDP. They have a grant writing guide. The Kellogg Foundation has a logic model toolkit. The University of Wisconsin also has a logic model site with templates and development guides. And the Foundation Center has a wonderful introduction to proposal writing course for foundation-specific proposals, and National Science Foundation has their PAPPG to guide your writing of NSF proposals. So I'm welcoming questions at this point, reflections. I'd like to hear what you're thinking, any questions about proposals, funders, your own writing. Let me know. We have time now for your questions, and feel free to unmute or drop the questions in the chat.
Hey, so I've got a question if you're ready.
I am ready.
So I'm looking at the logic model and just the different types of like the descriptors of the logic model. You have like inputs, activities, outputs, all those types of things. Would you typically like use those terms then to describe like for this proposed grant, here are the inputs, and then like discuss what those are and then move on to the activities or like how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the logic model is the visual. So that is going to be that would be a visual representation of your work. So it would look like it was on that slide screen with the it's sort of I sort of think of it more of it as a table, and I shouldn't, but it's really a process diagram where the one column you have the inputs, and then you have the activities, and then you have the outputs. There are some great templates on those resource sites for the visual representation. So it would look like this. This would be the input, activity, output, outcomes would be the headers for the visual, and then you would list them under sort of bullet points, very short, not a lot of text there. For the narrative, um, when you're writing the narrative, typically wouldn't speak to inputs in the way that you would in the visual. You would be more having your subsections like your project team, or you would have a subsection for, let's say, if you have advisory boards or other collaborators that are working together. So it wouldn't say inputs, but it would have, the same content as far as the personnel, the collaborators, that sort of thing. The activities are going to be structured differently, typically depending on the funding agency and what they like to see. So if you have an NSF proposal, you would be looking at listing your objectives and then sort of the activities under the objectives. Um, the outputs are typically going to be a part of the evaluation section. So when I was talking about the evaluation section of the proposal, you're typically going to speak to your outputs and outcomes in the evaluation section for most programmatic projects. Um, if you're looking at more of a research study where you might have specific aims and hypotheses, and then that would come in your approach or your methodology that all kind of goes together. And you typically outline that by the specific aim or by the objective and have the expected outcomes after each aim or each objective. So
Okay,
that's
that makes
something that,
sense then.
oh, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Now that makes sense. It looks like, would you have, I guess you could do it either way then. You could describe it like this visually and kind of use more of a slide presentation for those things, or I guess you could use more of like a spreadsheet type of a table too, would still be similar too.
Yeah,
So,
and
okay.
there are definitely different styles. You'll see on those sites there are different multiple styles that people use for logic models as far as the visual goes, like from a table that has a little more information, a brief visual like this. And the key really is, because we want grant proposals to be so repetitive in some ways, is that you're going to have, like, let's say, the visual of the logic model that's short and sweet like this, and a narrative description of your project that expands on what you've presented in the logic model. So we could have a tired reviewer who could look at the visual and make some connections with that information, and then a reviewer who really wants to get into the details, and who wants to read through the narrative and more detailed information.
Sarah, we have